Hi everyone. Today we'll finish off the period of the early republic by looking at the administrations of James Madison and James Monroe, the War of 1812, and the issue of territorial expansion in the years after. When James Madison, who we see again here, succeeded Jefferson as president in 1809, he inherited a host of problems, both foreign and domestic. The nation's economy was suffering under the weight of the embargo. Impressment still threatened American seamen, and to add to Madison's troubles, Indians under a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh were stirring up mischief once again in the region of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. When it came to deciding what he should do first, Madison did not hesitate. Although he had won the election of 1808 over Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the results demonstrated a resurgence in Federalist Party momentum that worried Madison and Jefferson. They decided to abandon the near universally unpopular embargo policy. In January 1809, Congress repealed the Embargo Act, and Jefferson signed the repeal measure into law on his way out of office that March. Opening the economy back up was a no-brainer, politically speaking. Dealing with the Indians on the frontier and the escalating tensions over impressment, however, proved much more difficult for the nation's fourth president. Upon moving into the White House, Madison first had to face the ever-mounting frustration and anger, both in Congress and the public at large, over the issue of impressment. England especially continued to violate the rights of Americans on the high seas. A young group of congressmen began to speak out about the ineptitude of the United States' response to the crisis. They became known as the War Hawks. They included, as we see here, figures that would become legends in the history of American politics. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Henry Clay of Kentucky, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts. The Warhawks were prepared to go to war with Great Britain, but impressment was not their only concern. They also wanted to expand the boundaries of the United States at England's expense, namely by invading Canada. Every day, another speech in Congress raised the pressure on Madison to act. While he was attempting to deal with the restless Congress, the president was also listening to reports from the western frontier about Indian troubles. Not long after he took office, at the end of September 1809, the Delaware Indians, along with other groups, signed an agreement with the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, to cede some 3 million acres of land, opening the way for more white settlement into both Indiana and Illinois. Here we have a portrait painting of Harrison. The agreement became known as the Treaty of Fort Wayne. The Shawnee Indians, who occupied a small portion of the area, had been left out of the treaty negotiations entirely, and they were not happy about it. In 1810, the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, who we have an artist's interpretation of here, traveled to meet with Harrison. He wanted to convince the governor to tear up the treaty, arguing that it was invalid without Shawnee consent, something the United States government knew it could never get, which was why the Shawnee had been left out of the negotiations in the first place. Here we have an artist's sketch imagining the meeting between Tecumseh and Harrison. The governor rejected the Shawnee demands. In response, Tecumseh stepped up his efforts to form a pan-Indian confederacy to resist the American advance up and down the western frontier of settlement. He was aided in these efforts, at least for a while, by his brother, Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet. A year prior to the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1808, Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh had formed a base of operations just north of today's Lafayette, Indiana, that the Americans called Prophetstown. Indians from throughout the region came to listen initially not to Tecumseh, but his brother. Tenskwatawa had only recently risen to a position of power and influence. For most of his life, he was an outcast within Shawnee society. As a child, playing with his bow, he was severely injured, losing sight in his right eye. This prevented him from becoming an effective warrior and caused him much shame and humiliation. As a young man, he took to alcohol and gained a reputation in Shawnee society as a drunkard, who not infrequently beat his wife and children. Here we have an artist's interpretation of Tenskwatawa. He was not liked or admired. But then, beginning in 1805, he had a series of religious visions that changed his life, after suffering another accident that nearly killed him. One night he got so drunk that he passed out, falling forward into a campfire while others were asleep. He was severely burned and fell into a coma. It was during this state of unconsciousness that he claimed to have received visions from the Great Spirit. In them, he saw two different futures for Indian peoples. In one set of visions, the Shawnee and other groups actively traded with the Americans, converted to Christianity, signed away their land, became dependent upon alcohol, and lost everything to the white man. In another set of visions, he saw Indians turning away from the Americans, refusing to sign treaties or trade away their livelihoods for liquor. It was a complete return to Indian ways and beliefs, and a complete distancing from the ways of the white man. At the end of this set of visions, Indians prospered, held on to their lands, and remained autonomous peoples. The visions convinced Tenskwatawa to tell his story and to become a religious leader not just of his own Shawnee people, but Indians throughout the region of the Ohio Valley. He turned into a very effective public speaker, and his brother, Tecumseh, saw in his brother's rising influence a chance to win recruits for his own vision of a pan-Indian confederacy that could stand against the United States and protect Indian lands. The base at Prophetstown the brothers established in 1808 quickly drew a sizable following, and it worried the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, greatly. After his run-in with Tecumseh in 1810, where he refused to tear up the Treaty of Fort Wayne, Harrison became even more concerned, and he notified the government in Washington of his anxieties. As his brother preached to larger and larger numbers of Indians who came to Prophetstown to hear his message, Tecumseh traveled through the region, recruiting warriors, and threatening hesitant tribes not to honor the terms of the Treaty of Fort Wayne. But Tecumseh knew he was not powerful enough yet to take on the Americans. That is why he met with Harrison again in August 1811 at Vincennes, Indiana, and to buy time, lied, saying that he and his brother the Prophet meant to remain at peace with the United States. Shortly after, he set out for the southeast, to Georgia and Alabama, looking to extend his confederacy and recruit among groups like the Cherokee, Creeks, and others. Harrison was not fooled, and he looked to take advantage of Tecumseh's absence by preemptively attacking and destroying Prophetstown. By early November, he was on the outskirts of the settlement with a force of over 1,000. He'd notified the Madison administration of the situation and won approval for the assault if it proved necessary. As it turned out, Tenskwatawa made the decision for Harrison. After suggesting truce talks, the Prophet ordered a surprise attack on the American force under Harrison. The encounter became known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. In making the attack, Tenskwatawa went against his brother's wishes. Tecumseh had warned him to abandon Prophetstown if an American army approached, rather than sacrifice his warriors before they were ready. But apparently, Tenskwatawa had become too much a believer in his own powers. As this sketch shows, before the battle, he told his warriors that his incantations would render them invincible against the Americans. It was a tragic mistake. The Indians were badly defeated at Tippecanoe. Harrison, shown in this print, leading his troops to victory, became a national hero and eventually president, mostly because of his success in this one battle. There have been many artistic renderings of Tippecanoe over the years. Here are a couple of them that date close to the time of the battle. Tecumseh, upon learning of the events, was by all accounts furious with his brother, who overnight lost his status and influence with the Indians of the region. His time as a leader was over. Tecumseh's Pan-Indian Confederacy had been temporarily weakened, but it was far from finished. When the War of 1812 broke out, he formed an alliance with the British. At the beginning of June 1812, President Madison finally gave in to the demands of the Warhawks and sent a message to Congress detailing a list of grievances against Great Britain. The House of Representatives and the Senate concurred after close votes that included no support from the Federalists on a declaration of war that Madison signed into law on June 18th. What some called the Second War of American Independence, and the Federalist Party called Mr. Madison's War, did not begin very auspiciously for the United States. In August, just a couple of months into the conflict, British forces, joined by Tecumseh and his Pan-Indian Confederacy of warriors, took Detroit, Michigan. Madison's problems with the British and with the Indians had merged into one potentially lethal combination. It would be a year before the Americans were in a position to take the region back, and when they finally did, it was thanks to a feature of the conflict that few expected when it began: success against the British Royal Navy by American frigates of war. Perhaps the most famous of the American naval victories came at the Battle of Lake Erie, where Commodore Oliver Perry, who we have here, successfully led a flotilla of 9 American ships against 6 ships of the British Royal Fleet. In the initial engagement on September 10, 1813, Perry's flagship was so damaged that he had to abandon it and move to another during the fight, a moment captured in this illustration from the period. The victory at Lake Erie successfully cut off the British supply line to Detroit, making it a crucial strategic success. It inspired a host of paintings and prints at the time. Here are just a couple more examples. When the British realized their lines of supply were cut, troops at Detroit under Major General Henry Proctor were forced to retreat north, up the Thames River, into Lower Canada, to a site called Moravian Town. They were followed by the Tribal Confederacy under Tecumseh. It was here on October 5, 1813, just a few weeks after Perry's success on Lake Erie, that American forces under William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe, caught up with them. In the clash that came to be known as the Battle of the Thames, the British evacuated the field, and more importantly, from the perspective of James Madison and the American government at the time, the great Indian leader Tecumseh was killed. Here's a print from the time that imagined the event. It never has been established who was responsible for the shot or shots that felled him. But with Tecumseh's death, his Pan-Indian Confederacy also collapsed. One of James Madison's biggest worries was behind him, even as the war raged on. In later years, Tecumseh became an icon of American freedom, not just for Indian peoples, but even white Americans, not a few of whom took his name, like the Civil War era general, William Tecumseh Sherman. He became such a symbol not because of his military or even political exploits, but because his fight for freedom was unblemished by compromise. Tecumseh was a hero figure who did not disappoint. His vision of liberty for Indian peoples was total. He never even contemplated giving away an inch of Indian land, never signed a treaty, and never backed down, ultimately sacrificing all for his cause on the battlefield, facing his enemy to the very end. In the early part of 1814, attention in the war shifted to the southeast, where the last remnants of Tecumseh's Indian Confederacy, a portion of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks, held out in the Mississippi Territory, in what's today central Alabama. Madison had sent a general from Tennessee, soon to be more famous than William Henry Harrison, to the region to crush the power of the Creek Indians. This, of course, was Andrew Jackson, who we have in this portrait painting. At the end of March, Jackson and a force of over 3,000, including hundreds of Cherokee Indians, attacked and killed 800 of the 1,000 Creek Indian resistors at a place called Horseshoe Bend. Here we have a couple of sketches from the battle. An initial artillery bombardment had failed to dislodge the Red Sticks from their fortifications. The defense ultimately fell apart after Jackson ordered a frontal assault with bayonets, a moment captured in this illustration. Toward the end of 1814, in August, the Creeks, as depicted in this sketch from the period, signed what became known as the Treaty of Fort Jackson, in which they ceded some 23 million acres of land to the United States government. Madison did not have long to enjoy the news, however. Just 2 weeks after the treaty at Fort Jackson was signed by the Creeks, the British landed a force of over 4,000 on the Virginia coast. On August 24th, they engaged an American force of over 6,000 at what became known as the Battle of Bladensburg. Despite being outnumbered, the British routed the American force, opening a clear path to Washington, D.C. By that evening, they were in the city, burning down the White House and much of the nation's capital. When they were finished, they returned to their ships and prepared to move north to Baltimore. This is a sketch of what the White House looked like in Madison's day. And here's another, done during the British invasion as it burned. President Madison was forced to evacuate the White House with the rest of the government, and his wife Dolly became famous for saving a portrait painting of George Washington from being lost in the flames, a moment captured in this illustration of the time. And here it is today, still hanging in the people's house. With hopes now resting on the defense of Baltimore, all focus shifted to the city. On September 12th, and again on the 13th, American forces defeated the British in engagements just outside of the town and withstood a bombardment from the Royal Navy at Fort McHenry, flying the battle flag that inspired Francis Scott Key to pen the poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner, the country's national anthem. The defense of Baltimore was memorialized in art at the time and later. Here are just a few of the illustrations from the period. The first here shows the troops gathering to defend the city. And here are a couple of the bombardment at Fort McHenry. And this one showing the moment when Key supposedly saw the flag and was inspired to compose his famous lyrics. With the defeat of the British at Baltimore, the government returned to Washington. On December 1st, 1814, American and British negotiators met at the city of Ghent in today's Belgium to start discussing an end to the war. 2 weeks later, without knowing about the talks in Europe, 26 Federalist Party delegates from across New England met at the old State House in Hartford, Connecticut, captured in this sketch, to discuss their own grievances against the federal government and what they called Mr. Madison's War. The press was aware of the meetings, but their content was kept a secret, and no notes were recorded. This placed what came to be known as the Hartford Convention under suspicion right from the start. In addition to airing their economic grievances, it was rumored and highly likely that the delegates discussed seceding from the United States. Their timing could not have been worse. While the delegates at Hartford were still holding their 3-week-long series of meetings, on December 24th, the negotiators at Ghent reached an accord and signed a treaty ending the War of 1812. The moment was captured in this famous painting. It would be several weeks before the news reached Washington and the rest of the country. To confound matters from the Federalist perspective, just a few days after they concluded their convention on January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson defeated a large British force at the Battle of New Orleans, shortly before news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived. The events at New Orleans have been memorialized seemingly countless times. Here are a couple from the period. The first showing Jackson commanding the defense of the city. And the second one that we have here depicting the moment when the British commanding general, Edward Pakenham, was killed. In the wake of Jackson's stunning total victory at New Orleans and news of the Treaty of Ghent, The Federalists suddenly looked like traitors to their country. The Hartford Convention marked the beginning of the end of the Federalist Party. Soon it would disappear completely, never again factoring in national elections. This political cartoon of the time really said it all. By mid-February 1815, both the British and the United States had ratified the Treaty of Ghent. The War of 1812 was officially over. Both sides returned territory conquered during the conflict, and there was a return to the status quo that existed before the war. The United States had fought Great Britain to a draw and survived, but it did not gain Canada. The dreams of the war hawks in Congress did not materialize. But a new national hero emerged. As we can see in this illustration from the time, Andrew Jackson, after New Orleans, became the most recognized and famous American after George Washington. What few could have known at the time was that the War of 1812 marked the last instance in which the United States and Great Britain would be enemies in a major conflict. The decades that followed the war witnessed the forging of closer ties between the two countries, built out of what both perceived as a set of mutual interests. James Monroe, who we have here in one of his most recognized portrait paintings, the last in the early Virginia dynasty of presidents, took office in 1817. He faced a different set of challenges than all his predecessors, in that the international and domestic context of events had changed dramatically. With the Napoleonic Wars over in Europe, the issue of impressment disappeared. The Federalist Party was no longer a national factor. One-party rule for a while in Washington led some to characterize the period of Monroe's administrations as the era of good feelings in American history, the last years of the early republic. The Indians of the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region had been subdued, and in the southeast, the Creek Nation had been crushed. The top priority of the Monroe presidency became territorial expansion, particularly in the southeast, where a campaign against the Seminole Indians of Florida was launched at the end of 1817. Spanish Florida had long been a refuge for runaway slaves. Many were known to have taken up lives with the Indians there, becoming known as Black Seminoles. It was under this pretext of securing runaway slaves and punishing the Indians for harboring them that Andrew Jackson, who we see again here, was sent to the Florida Peninsula in November. In March and April 1818, Jackson's troops fought, killed, and scattered villages of Seminoles and escaped slaves in places like Pensacola, Tallahassee, and even Tampa Bay. Here we have a couple of artistic imaginings of scenes from what became known as the First Seminole War. Crucially, while Jackson was marching his way through Florida, Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, the second President of the United States, opened negotiations with Spain to try and acquire the territory. Here we have the most famous portrait painting of John Quincy Adams. He knew that Spain was not in a position, militarily, to hold on to Florida, and that Jackson's campaign strengthened his diplomatic hand. With the wars of Latin American independence underway in the early decades of the 19th century, the Spanish were all too willing to cede Florida in exchange for agreeing on a permanent boundary with the United States that we see indicated by the red line on this map. As part of the deal for Florida, the U.S. reassured Spain it was giving up any claim to Texas, a promise it never had any intention of honoring in the long term. What was known as the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed in 1819, and Florida officially became part of the United States in 1821. The region of the Panhandle over the next several decades would become one of the wealthiest parts of the South's Cotton Kingdom. The Second Middle Passage had a new prime destination. The same year that the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed, in 1819, the territory of Missouri applied for statehood. Since the time of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, 5 new states had joined the federal union: Louisiana in 1812, Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1819. Up to this point, the country had avoided any divisive debates over slavery of the sort that threatened for a while to derail ratification of the Constitution. Among the reasons that North and South clashed over Missouri in 1819 when it applied for statehood was the fact that for the first time, national debates over slavery expansion concerned a territory that large numbers of northern free settlers and southern slaveholders both wanted to settle, and thus coveted. The fact that Congress's decision about restriction would mean exclusion for settlers from one section or the other meant that both the North and the South saw the Missouri controversy as a zero-sum game where their expansion was concerned. Leaders on both sides of the crisis understood the economics of slavery expansion in much the same way. Expansion would increase aggregate demand for slaves, maintain or increase slave prices, and increase slave populations. Restriction, on the other hand, would limit slave demand and cause a decline in slave prices, constraining slave population. What this meant was that sectional interests over the growth of slavery, for the first time since 1787, came into direct conflict. The sudden willingness of Northern leaders to challenge policies of slavery expansion in 1819 are best understood in terms of this question of white settler exclusion, not any abstract opposition to slavery or sympathy for its victims. Northern sectional interests were at stake, not the well-being of African Americans, either free or enslaved. As the debates over Missouri in Congress dragged on and became more heated and even vitriolic at times, many congressmen escalated the perceived stakes beyond the question of westward migration. Some began to see the Missouri debates as a sort of watershed, a clash between North and South that would determine far into the future overall control of the federal government and national policy. The compromise resulted from the collapse of the Northern state coalition opposed to slavery expansion when critical members abandoned it, such as the Bucktail Republicans of New York, led by Martin Van Buren, who we have in this portrait painting as a young man. And Pennsylvania congressmen such as Jonathan Roberts and Henry Baldwin, who we have in the next two images here. It's a picture of Roberts, and there's Baldwin. Forced to choose, these leading dough-face Northern politicians, as they came to be derisively known for their supposed betrayal of the North, opted for a compromise they saw as critical to preserving the federal union. The compromise reached first in 1820 and finalized by amendment in 1821, reflected on this map, admitted Maine as a free state and permitted Missouri to draft a state constitution without a slavery restriction. It additionally provided that slavery was to be forever prohibited in territory within the Louisiana Purchase and above 36 degrees 30 north latitude. Recognizing slavery as a long-term national institution, the Missouri Compromise formally divided parts of the West into free and slave territory. The deeper political and constitutional contest that the debates over Missouri initiated over the balance of power and control of national policy ended in a stalemate when neither side proved willing to risk civil war. The Missouri Compromise was designed to suppress slavery disputes by maintaining a sectional balance of power and territory, but the price of the compromise was that it transformed the Union into a political compact on slavery, in the sense that no constitutional rule of law applied to it. There was no agreed upon permanent allocation of authority between federal and state governments where slavery expansion was concerned, and no agreement on a neutral constitutional referee for disputes over it. The compromise deferred the problem of slavery for another 2 generations, at the cost of allowing the Second Middle Passage, the domestic slave trade within the United States, to expand into new parts of the nation at an alarming and frightful pace. Perhaps surprisingly, the thing that James Monroe, as president, is most remembered for is not the acquisition of Florida, the violence against the Seminole Indians and escaped fugitive slaves, or for guiding the nation through the crisis over Missouri and the expansion of slavery. He most often comes up in discussions about the 1823 Statement of American Foreign Policy that took his name, what we know as the Monroe Doctrine. It was first introduced at the end of the year as part of the President's annual message to Congress on the State of the Union. This was also a time when countries across Latin America and the Caribbean were throwing off the last vestiges of Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule and declaring their independence. What the Monroe Doctrine described was an old world and new world that made up distinct spheres of influence. From 1823 forward, the Western Hemisphere was to be off limits to any further European colonization, and the United States would not meddle in the affairs of European nations. Famous illustrations of the Monroe Doctrine were created at the time, depicting the president and his cabinet discussing the issue around a large standing globe in this painting, and a smaller table-sized globe in the second one that we have here, which is actually a mural that hangs in the nation's capital today. The idea of the Monroe Doctrine was captured in this popular political cartoon of the time. What made the policy ironic in 1823, and for basically the entirety of the 19th century, is that the United States did not possess the military strength to enforce it. What made it work was the fact that not the US, but Great Britain, specifically its Royal Navy, enforced it as a measure favorable to British economic interests. The practical result was that for the rest of the century, the United States was able to focus almost exclusively on its own internal affairs and to grow geographically through a brutal conquest of both Indians and Mexicans, completely free of any anxiety over the possibility of European interference. The country was on the verge of a completely new era in its history. Okay, so that's it for today. Next time we'll start talking about the beginnings of what some scholars call a market revolution in America. Changes in technologies and business, the rise of cities like New York, and immigration to the United States by Germans, and especially the Irish, after the Great Potato Famine of 1845.